Hello everyone, I hope you will enjoy watching this video. Hopefully you might learn something new. Have a good day to you all. So to start off, who is Sigmund Freud? Sigmund Freud is commonly referred to as the father of psychoanalysis, and his work has been tremendously influential in the popular imagination, popularizing such notions as the unconscious, defense mechanisms, Freudian slips and dream symbolism, while also making a long-lasting impact on fields as diverse as literature, film, Marxist and feminist theories, literary criticism, philosophy, and psychology. Though his ideas were controversial, Sigmund Freud was one of the most influential scientists in the fields of psychology and psychiatry. It has been over 100 years since Freud published his theories, yet he still influences what we think about personality and the mind.
Good morning, my name is Mark Joshua Rod from 280, and the topic that is assigned to our group is the psychoanalytic theory of personality by Sigmund Freud. According to Sigmund Freud, the theory of personality is composed of three elements which are known as the id, the ego, and the superego. So what is id? According to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, the id is the personality component made up of unconscious psychic energy that works to satisfy basic urges, needs, and desires. The id is an unconscious part of our personality. It is basically the childish and impulsive part of us that just do what it wants, and it wants things really intensely and doesn't really think about the consequences. Freud described this as operating on a pleasure principle, which essentially means what it sounds like, which is that it's always seeking to try to increase pleasure and decrease pain. For example, when we are kids, we want something like toys or foods, and we ask our parents to buy those things just to satisfy our own happiness. And we will get mad when they don't buy those things for us. And we don't care on our parents' feelings. We don't know what they're going through in their life, and the only thing that goes through our mind is to buy those things and satisfy ourselves.
Hi, I'm Carl Andrew R. Castañas and I'm discussing ID. ID is the most part of the personality. It also represents our animalistic urges, like the desire for food and sex. The ID seeks instant gratification for our wants and needs. If these needs or wants are not met, a person can become tense, anxious, or angry. Example: Sally was thirsty. Rather than waiting for the server to refill her glass of water, she reached across the table and drank from Mr. Smith's water's glass, much to surprise. Another example: Bart was stuck in traffic. He just wanted his vehicle to move. Encouraged at the situation, Bart pulled his car onto the shoulder and sped forward, not caring that he was clipping people's side mirrors as he tried to get ahead of the cars in the front of him. Another example: in line at the salad bar, Amy was so hungry that she shoved a handful of croutons in her mouth as she waited for the line to move. Another example: a hungry baby cried until he was fed. Another example is a toddler who wanted another helping of dessert wine incessantly until she was given another serving.
Good morning everyone, my name is Jared Dayanghirang and I will be discussing a closer look at the ego. In his 1933 book, New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, Freud compared the relationship between the id and the ego to that of a horse and rider. The horse represents the id, a powerful force that offers the energy to propel forward motion. The rider represents the ego, the guiding force that directs the power of the id toward the goal. The ego prevents us from acting on our basic urges, created by the id, but also works to achieve a balance with our moral and idealistic standards, created by the superego. While the ego operates in both the pre-conscious and conscious, its strong ties to the id means that it also operates in the unconscious. Sometimes it helps to look at the original source of these ideas to get a better perspective on the topic. So what did Freud have to say about his concept of the ego? He wrote extensively about the ego as well as its relationship to other aspects of personality. Toward the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of these senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as it is were a fact.
Hello everyone, my name is Eliza Christine Pantola. I hope you have learned a lot from my classmates on Sigmund Freud's first personality components. Now, let me discuss to you the second component, which is the ego. According to Freud, the ego develops from the id and ensures that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a manner that is socially acceptable in the real world. It exists to mediate between the unrealistic id and the external real world. It functions in the conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious mind. Therefore, it is also the one responsible for dealing with reality and decision-making of someone's personality. Ideally, the ego works by reason, whereas the id is chaotic and unreasonable. The ego operates according to the reality principle, working out realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands. When it comes to behavior, the ego manages to consider social realities and norms, etiquette, and rules in deciding how to behave. The ego, like the id, seeks pleasure and avoids pain. However, the ego is concerned with creating a realistic strategy for achieving pleasure, unlike the id. It has no idea of right or wrong. Something is good simply if it meets the end of satisfying without damaging himself or his id. The ego is involved in secondary thought about the method, which is logical, practical, and problem-solving driven. If an action plan fails to succeed, it will be thought over again until a solution is found. This is known as reality testing and helps the person, by mastery of the ego, to regulate their desires and show self-control.
Hello, I am Vincent Yorga and I will be presenting to you today the 12 ego defenses. Why do we need ego defenses? We use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from feelings of anxiety or guilt, which arise when we feel threatened, or because our id or superego becomes too demanding. Defense mechanisms operate at an unconscious level and help ward off unpleasant feelings, for example is anxiety, or make good things feel better for the individual. Ego defense mechanisms are natural and normal. When they get out of proportion, neuroses develop, such as anxiety states, phobias, obsessions, or hysteria. These are the examples of defense mechanisms. Number 1. Compensation. Compensation is the process of masking perceived negative self-concepts by developing positive self-concepts to make up for and to cover those perceived negative self-concepts. One example is that individuals with poor family lives might direct their energy into excelling above and beyond what is required at work. Number two is identification. As a defense mechanism, identifying yourselves with causes, groups, heroes, leaders, movie stars, organizations, religions, sports stars, or whatever you perceive as being good self-concepts of self-images. This identification is a way to think of yourself as a good concept of images. One example is that the government glorifying war to recruit cannon fodders, aka soldiers. Number three is repression. This is an unconscious mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. One example is that an adult suffers a nasty spider bite as a child and develops an intense phobia of spiders later in life without any recollection of the experience as a child. Number 4 is denial. This involves blocking external events from awareness. If some situation is just too much to handle, the person just refuses to experience it. One example is that a family may pretend and act as if their father is only sick or having a hard time when it is evident to everyone that he is an abusive alcoholic. Number 5 is projection. This involves individuals attributing their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and motives to the person. One example is that, for instance, you might hate someone, but your superego tells you that such hatred is unacceptable. You can solve the problem by believing that they hate you. Number 6 is displacement. This is a defense mechanism wherein you are satisfying an impulse with a substitute object. One example is that someone who is frustrated by his or her superiors may go home from work and kick the dog or beat up a family member. Number 7 is regression. This is a movement back in psychological time when one is faced with stress. You may be being criticized as an adult and feel horrible about it. To escape this, you revert to acting like a little child because you did not then own criticism as defining you as negative self-concepts, because others mostly thought of you as good images back then. Number 8 is sublimation. This is a defense mechanism wherein satisfying an impulse with a substitute object but in an acceptable way. One example is that extreme sports like boxing is an example of putting anger emotion into something constructive. Introjection. This defense mechanism is the acceptance of the standards of others to avoid being rated as negative self-concepts by their standards. One example is that a dad telling his son, "Boys don't cry." This is an idea that a person might take in from their environment and internalize into their way of thinking. Number 10. Rationalization. This is the process of explaining why, this time, you do not have to be judged as negative self-concepts because of your behaviors or intentions. That is, you justify and excuse your misdeeds or mistakes with reasons that are circumstantial at best and unfounded at worst. When a person finds the situation difficult to accept, they will make up a logical reason why it has happened. For example, a person may explain a natural disaster as God's will. Number 11. Reaction formation. This is the process of developing conscious positive self-concepts to cover and hide opposite negative self-concepts. It is the making up for negative self-concepts by showing off their reverse. One example is that men who have prejudice against homosexuals are making a defense against their own homosexual feelings by adopting a harsh anti-homosexual attitude which helps them convince of their heterosexuality. Number 12. Ritual and undoing. This defense mechanism is the process of trying to undo negative self-concept ratings of yourself by performing rituals or behaviors designed to offset the behaviors that the negative evaluations of you were based on. One example is a millionaire might give to charities for the poor to make up for profiting from the poor. Alternatively, a parent might buy his or her children many gifts to make up for not spending time with them.
Hi, I am Marcel Asang, and what I'm about to discuss is the last component of personality to develop, which is the superego. What is superego? According to Sigmund Freud, The superego begins to emerge at around ages 3 to 5 years old. It provides guidelines for making judgments. The superego, or the moral principle, is to do what the society says is right, or what you believe is morally right given the situation. The superego's function is to control the age impulses, especially those which society forbids, such as sex and aggression. It also has the function of persuading the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic ones and to strive for perfection. Superego consists of two systems, the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience can punish the ego through causing feelings of guilt. For example, if the ego gives into the id's demands, the superego may make the person feel bad through guilt. The ideal self, or ego ideal, is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be and represents career aspirations, how to treat other people, and how to behave as a member of society. The superego tries to perfect and civilize our behavior. It works to suppress all unacceptable urges of the id and struggles to make the ego act upon idealistic standards rather than upon realistic principles. The superego is present in the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious.
Relationship between the id, the ego, and superego, and what might happen if there is an imbalance. A positive and healthy personality can create a balance between the three personality components, conflicting its biological, psychological, and social nature successfully. If the energy balance is not fairly distributed, it may lead to behavioral issues and psychosocial tensions. If the id takes control, the weakened ego and superego cannot restrain it. The person experiencing this will start to act impulsively and will, without postponement, try to satisfy his/her needs. For example, an individual with an overly dominant id might become uncontrollable or even become a criminal. A person who has a strong ego seems to be measured, reasonable, and cold. On the other hand, a person who has a dominant superego are prone to self-judgment, high standards, and a feeling of inferiority and self-criticism, putting himself in a constant conflict with the environment. An imbalance, particularly with anything, lacks proportion and relationship between corresponding things. According to Sigmund Freud, the same process applies with a person's personality and behavior. It needs equilibrium. In simple words, too much of something and too little of the others may have a negative effect to someone's personality.